What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another datasheet deep dive. This is the Warhammer 40k series, where we take one datasheet in the game and analyze it in excruciating detail. And with how effective they've been over the last couple weeks, I think it's time to turn our attention to the Thousand Sons and their demon Primarch Magnus. Magnus might be one of the strongest units in 40k, and while the remainder of the Thousand Sons army tends to be expensive and fragile ancient sorcerers, Magnus himself is wildly powerful and single-handedly propels Thousand Sons to an incredible win rate. So today we're going to talk about him, his datasheet synergies within the Thousand Sons faction, and some ways that you can deal with Thousand Sons armies playing Magnus the Red. So first off, let's talk about his stat block. Magnus comes in at an exceptional top line profile with an extremely fast movement of 14, resilient toughness and save characteristics with T11 rivaling most main battle tanks, a 2+ base armor save backed up by a 4+ invulnerable save. That means that this guy's going to be able to shake off most low AP shooting and even a lot of anti-tank weapons. Things like melta guns need 5s to wound him because of that high toughness characteristic. That's all protecting 16 wounds, an OC value of 6, making him incredibly good at stealing objectives away from a surprising number of enemies. He's actually good at taking them away from small units of 5 models, for example. Most other heavy vehicles in the game, things like Land Raiders and other equivalents, only come in at OC 5, meaning that Magnus has the opportunity to simply steal objectives out from them by walking onto them, and a strong leadership characteristic of 5. Now, the leadership characteristic is actually surprisingly important here because Magnus is the single most powerful Kabbalistic sorcerer in the game. This means that based on the Thousand Sons faction ability, Cabal of Sorcerers, he generates 4 Cabal points for your Cabal pool. These points can be spent on executing rituals for your army, and it's important to keep Magnus both safe and unbattle shocked because he is going to be the biggest source of these points over the course of the game. And that kind of exemplifies Magnus in most Thousand Sons armies. He is simultaneously both the biggest force multiplier in the army and the biggest recipient of buffs, making his status incredibly important for the game state. Part of that is because he comes packing some insane ranged attacks. He has both the Gaze of Magnus and Tzeentch's Firestorm, 2 attacks he can use together. Both of them have a range of 24 inches and are psychic weapons. Tzeentch's Firestorm is a blast weapon firing D6 plus 3 shots at strength 5, AP 1, 2 damage. It being a blast weapon means that Magnus oftentimes can't use it in the circumstances where he'd like to. Engaging Magnus the Red is actually a little bit annoying for him, and he's not able to use that Firestorm firing into melee. However, his other weapon is A-OK. The Gaze of Magnus has devastating wounds baked in, fires 3d3 attacks at strength 9, AP 2, 3 damage. Now, the fact that that's 3d3 attacks is actually kind of important because it does mean that for a single CP, you can reroll all d3s of that attack value because it's a combined profile. That means that if you roll triple ones and you have CP to burn, Magnus can actually pad his attack count, meaning that that's actually a very consistent number of shots. Now, both of these are buffed by one of his strongest special rules, Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerers, which gives Thousand Sons Psychers +1 to hit and wound on psychic attacks within 6 inches. Importantly, this affects Magnus himself, but it also affects all types of weapons if you're in a Psyker unit. Important to note that any non-Psyker equipped with psychic weapons, for example, a Rhino using psychic weapons out of a firing deck, does not benefit from Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerers. You have to have that Psyker keyword. But it also affects your melee attacks, which includes Magnus's powerful melee weapons. He can swing his Blade of Magnus either with 7 strength 16 AP 3 damage devastating strike attacks or a sweep attack for 14 attacks, but at only strength 8 AP 1 for 1 damage. Now, this weapon profile is incredibly good. It is a little inconsistent since Magnus has no access to fight phase rerolls, so he has the opportunity to just flub on either the hit or wound roll, but at strength 16 with +1 to wound from Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerers, he's wounding every single enemy in the game on 2s, and even if he's down to 6 wounds and his damaged trait has turned on, he will still hit on 2s unless your opponent has additional hit penalties applied to them because he's giving himself +1 to hit, so lets him circumvent that downside. Assuming your dice don't go cold, Magnus has the capacity to one-tap a shocking array of enemies with this melee attack, and he is probably good to kill one of anything with his ranged attack. He's also benefiting from that +1 to hit and wound on those guns as well, not to mention the fact that being psychic weapons, they are benefiting from basically all of the Thousand Suns stratagems and internal faction synergies, so it is conceivable for Magnus to kill 2 or 3 enemy units in a single turn. And oftentimes you'll have to, because part of Magnus's niche within a Thousand Suns army is kind of making up for their expensive units otherwise. Now, not only is Magnus buffing your offensive power, but he also has his Crimson King ability, which can improve his survivability or the maneuverability of your army. At the start of each battle round, he'll choose one Crimson King ability to apply for that battle round. This includes Impossible Form, subtracting 1 from the damage characteristic of non-psychic weapons. That is important to note. He doesn't get it against psychic attacks, so sometimes there are some random attacks that will apply to Magnus at their full damage, and it is a little hilarious in a Thousand Suns mirror or against armies like Tyranids, but as we'll talk about once we move to internal faction synergies, he can use Psychic Dominion to protect himself against those psychic attacks regardless, so this isn't really that much of a downside. His other most powerful aura is Time Flux. He can switch off of his Impossible Form to activate a 6-inch aura of +2 move. This includes both Magnus and other Thousand Suns models within 6 inches, putting him to a staggering move of 16. And importantly, Thousand Suns are a faction with access to Temporal Surge, so they can double move their units, and keeping Magnus in range of units when they are using Temporal Surge, even if it's just on Magnus himself, allows you to get a lot of additional usefulness out of this. You can potentially turn on the buff at the start of the battle round, move units next to Magnus, gaining the +2 on them, move Magnus himself, benefiting from the +2 to get him in range of other models who can then move with that +2-inch movement and potentially double move, also benefiting from that +2. He has the capacity, if you are in a position where Magnus can get his auras anywhere on the table you need to essentially apply this +2 movement buff to everything in the Thousand Suns army. His last ability is significantly less powerful. At the start of your opponent's shooting phase, you select an enemy within 24 inches invisible to Magnus. He gives their ranged weapons hazardous. This is almost always worse than choosing one of the other effects. It's a very reactive effect, and your opponent can simply just choose not to shoot with that unit if they're really worried about hazardous. Any defensive consideration an opponent would be taking into account by their weapons having hazardous would probably be offset by simply giving yourself -1 damage and taking less damage from them, or by moving your units farther around the table so they can get out of line of sight or more models into cover. Treason of Tzeentch is the one Crimson King ability that is almost never chosen. So all told, that gives us a picture of basically the full package. One of the reasons that Magnus is so strong is that his datasheet has really no visible weaknesses. He's extremely fast. He deals incredible damage both at ranged and melee, and supports his army an immense amount. The downside is that means that all of the focus of a Thousand Suns army is going to be on Magnus. However, Thousand Suns have a lot of incredible buffs for him, so let's talk about what those are. Now, the only Thousand Suns detachment ability at the time of recording is from their Cult of Magic detachment. This allows you to choose devastating, sustained, or lethal hits at the start of your command phase and apply that to all of your psychic weapons. This is a little bit of anti-synergy with Magnus because most of his weapons are devastating already. His strike profile and his Blade of Magnus certainly is, and his Gaze of Magnus is already. Devastating Wounds is basically the best of these to choose, so it means that you're not getting the full effectiveness out of that ability, but it is applying to all your other psychic weapons, so it's not really that big of a deal. Sustained Hits is also good, especially if your opponent does not have good armor saves, and you don't necessarily need Devastating Wounds to punch through their save characteristics. Sustained Hits allows Magnus to generate a lot of additional value from his attacks, especially if you are, for example, Twist of Fating a low armor save unit, maybe a 3+ armor save, and getting rid of most of, if not all, of their defenses. Sustained Hits can give Magnus a surge of additional damage to ensure that he punches through those things, but it is chosen fairly rarely. On top of that, the army ability Kabbalistic Rituals has incredible buffs for Magnus. As the single central focal point of the army, he's basically the best place to apply any buffs. This includes save rerolls from Weaver of Fates, additional movement from Temporal Surge, and free stratagems that we'll talk about momentarily from Echoes from the Warp. Now, what stratagems can you use these CP discounts on? Basically, all of the Thousand Suns stratagems are built around making their sorcerers deal incredible damage and be much more survivable, and that is exactly what Magnus wants to be doing. This includes some defensive effects like Destined by Fate, choosing in the result of a failed saving throw to change the damage characteristic of an attack to 0. This is incredibly impactful since Magnus is already going to be protected by lots of rerolls and strong save characteristics, and having that 1 CP damage blank in the chamber means that you oftentimes can't even get value from an unlucky string of dice from the Thousand Suns player. Psychic Dominion is the other one. This protects him against psychic weapons when his impossible form normally wouldn't. It grants psychic weapons targeting him hazardous and gives him a 4+ feel no pain against psychic attacks. Interestingly, there is a little bit of counterplay from many psychic attacks against this stratagem. The stratagem itself only comes into play after Magnus or whichever unit you're using it on has been targeted by an attack. However, it doesn't work against any non-attack psychic attacks. Things like in the Thousand Suns mirror match, Doombolt, for example, is not actually attack, and so Psychic Dominion is not usable in response to its targeting. Other effects like Typhus's Mortal Wound Generator or Vortex of Doom from Grey Knights, they don't follow an attack sequence, so the stratagem can't be used in response. However, if it looks like Magnus is in danger of them, because those effects are used in the shooting phase, if you shoot any other weapons, even if the weapons are not psychic at Magnus, he can use Psychic Dominion against the other attacks to then grant himself the 4+ feel no pain against future psychic attacks, even if those attacks don't target like normal attacks do. This means if you have those Mortal Wound Generators like Vortex of Doom and you're trying to apply them to Magnus, you have to use those first before targeting him with any other guns. Otherwise, he will turn on his Psychic Dominion and those will be half as effective. That one's a little bit confusing since psychic attacks are kind of poorly defined in the 40k rules. A psychic attack is an attack from a weapon with the psychic keyword or any mortal wound generated by an ability with the psychic keyword. And while those mortal wound generators are psychic attacks, capital P, capital A, they are not regular attacks. It's very confusing. Now, offensively, most of the stratagems in the Thousand Suns faction also benefit Magnus quite a bit. He can use Devastating Sorcery to reroll his hit roll and wound roll. This is basically going to be used on him every single turn, although it is important to keep in mind, and I have seen many Thousand Suns players misplay this, that it is shooting phase only. You can't use it to buff his melee attacks. He has no access to rerolls in the fight phase, again, which is the reason that his melee attacks can occasionally be incredibly inconsistent. However, this makes his ranged attacks incredibly strong, especially combined with devastating wounds dealt by the detachment ability. This is oftentimes where your echoes from the warp are going each turn as well. If you have enough Cabal points, you can just windmill slam that onto Magnus, because you know you're almost assuredly going to be using that Gates of Magnus every turn, because you know you're going to be using that Devastating Sorcery on him almost every turn. That is basically just a CP back into your CP bank, which, as we'll discuss later, is ruinously important for Magnus to keep topped up. Sorcerous Might improves the range of his psychic weapons by 9 inches, putting them up to an impressive 33. One downside of his ranged weapons is that they're long range, but not super long range. You can't really reach across the table and touch you with them unless you are using this stratagem. Warp Sight also allows him to gain indirect fire and ignore cover. Ignore cover is important because if he is not dealing devastating damage, and that is a little random despite the fact that he is rolling a bunch of attacks with a bunch of rerolls, you don't know if those are going to be devastating wounds or not, so cover actually applies to Magnus quite a bit. Especially against strong armor saves, being able to protect yourself in cover and hope he doesn't roll those devastating wounds is one way for Magnus not to accrue value. And Magnus is so important to Thousand Suns game plan that if he is not passively gaining that value over the course of the game, you're actually gonna find yourself pretty far behind. The flip side being that he is really good at killing stuff. So all that together means that he can potentially be firing 3d3 plus d6 plus 3 potentially additional blast attacks, all multi-damage with devastating wounds, full hit and wound rerolls, +1 to hit and wound, ignore cover, and indirect fire. Once all of these effects are assembled, Magnus the Red goes absolutely crazy on the amount of damage he can deal. And while it is a little inconsistent, he has the capacity to one-tap most units in 40k with a solid turn of rolling with his ranged attacks. If he follows that up with a melee attack as well, he can be killing 2 units out of his opponent's army every turn, all the while being protected by those stratagems as well. Now, on top of that, he can also be benefited by other datasheets in the faction. While Magnus is typically the one doing the buffing, and usually he acts as a force multiplier for his faction, if you don't want to be using Devastating Sorcery on him to get those full rerolls. You can get reroll 1s to hit out of a Terminator Sorcerer. This saves you the CP or allows you to use that Devastating Sorcery somewhere else, but is usually only useful if Magnus is shooting into a lighter target. His attacks are so crucial that you usually want to be getting those wound rerolls from Devastating Sorcery. I actually think that the Terminator Sorcerer is kind of underplayed in the Thousand Suns faction. Just having reroll 1s to hit on a stick, especially for some of the heavier guns in the army like Forge Fiends or Mutalith Vortex Beasts, is pretty good, and he's a pretty solid and tanky sorcerer by himself. If you want to further improve his damage output and not have to use Warp Sight to get around cover, the Helldrake can strip cover from enemies by moving over them, although to be fair, this is a little inconsistent because you do have to move over them. It's not a ranged attack tied thing, which is a little strange, and the Helldrake himself is very expensive. Last but certainly not least, and the synergy that is most commonly used alongside Magnus, is the Foot Demon Prince. This guy has an aura of stealth, which can make a lot of the slightly tankier Thousand Suns units like Mutalith Vortex Beasts and Magnus incredibly sticky to remove, and Magnus being able to sit behind that -1 damage, strong save characteristics, damage blanks, save rerolls, and also -1 to be hit, just makes him an impossibility to kill for many armies. Magnus also helps out the Demon Prince as well by buffing his melee output with that Lord of the Planet of the Sorcerers effect, which is kind of nice for a character who is expensive but kind of pillow-fisted when it comes to combat. Now, speaking of actually killing Magnus, let's talk about dealing with this Demon Primarch. Many armies in the game will lack the capacity to kill Magnus, but what you'll find playing against Thousand Suns is that oftentimes it's not actually necessary to kill him. You can instead force Magnus to do so much work that he gets a little overworked and a little tired. He has the capacity to kill 2 enemy units every turn, but if he's forced to do that turn in and turn out and the rest of your army isn't contributing so much, they're actually going to run out of steam fairly quickly, and you probably beat the army on scenario. One of the important ways to do this is to ensure that if you have threats that can deal Magnus, to keep them safe. The Thousand Suns player is going to be attempting to remove all of the threat to the Demon Primarch in the early game so that he can run around and do whatever he wants in the late game and actually make up for that attritional deficit. So if you have particularly dangerous units, things like Eradicator squads, things like Fire Discipline Eradicator squads or Morven Vol that have extremely strong anti-tank weapons, and especially, as we'll discuss momentarily, Melta weapons, keeping them in an aggressive position but not exposing them too early is important, because that's going to force Magnus to deal his damage from farther away. And the farther away you can force Magnus to engage with you, the less effective he's going to be, the more stratagems he's going to have to use on himself, and all of that is incredibly important. And that moves us on to the next point. It is important to keep command points low against armies with Magnus the Red. This is because he himself is such a command point and cabal point hog that his damage output is oftentimes proportional to the number of command points that the Thousand Suns player has available. Not only do command points allow them to play Magnus more aggressively because they can use defensive stratagems on him, but it also means that they can use Warp Sight and Devastating Sorcery more freely to project his power to deal that additional damage. If you force those stratagems to be used in other situations, for example, keeping other Thousand Sun sorcerers alive, or you poke attacks into the Demon Primarch to potentially threaten him and force him to blank damage early on in the game, that can keep their command points down, and later on, Magnus will run out of steam. Lord of Deceit effects are also important here. If you are actually trying to kill Magnus, being able to plop something like a Calidus Assassin in range of him to double the cost of any CP rerolls or that Destined by Fate stratagem means that the Thousand Suns player is going to have significantly less resources to protect him with, and that could even spell his death. Now, if you actually want to kill him, there are a couple things that are pretty solid. Getting around his damage reduction is a big deal. Mortal wounds are a good way to do this. We talked about some ways you can get around Psychic Dominion with Psychic Mortal Wound effects. A bunch of Brotherhood Librarians, for example, using Vortex of Doom can actually just kill this guy very quickly on some good rolls, and so against armies like Grey Knights, Magnus has to be exceedingly careful. On top of that, if you have bonus damage, they can get around the damage blank from Destined by Fate. Melta weapons are a good example of this. If they are firing within their optimal Melta range, they're adding 2 to their damage characteristic. The way that works is that Destined by Fate will reduce their base damage of usually D6 down to 0, then their bonus Melta damage will apply, allowing you to deal 2 or 3 damage based on the Melta characteristic of your weapons and getting value through even when your opponent's spending CP to try to block you. Now, if you have units that can threaten Magnus and you are forcing him to play more cagey, that means that the Thousand Suns player has to play more aggressively with their other units, their Rubric Marines and other sorcerers. Thousand Thousand Sons don't have that many units in their army, and while Magnus the Red can be an unkillable god in some game states, if you kill the rest of his army, he usually isn't enough to reclaim the win all by himself. So focusing on those other units and ensuring you can get rid of them, force the Thousand Sons player to expose their more valuable units in order to actually score primary and secondary points, for example, and put mission pressure on them, that can oftentimes be enough to beat their army, even if you just ignore Magnus over the course of the game. This is many players' strategy against him. If you are layering the offense and defense on the Demon Primarch, he deals so much damage and is so difficult to kill that it's not really worth trying. And the fact that he can only realistically kill 2 or maybe on a really good day 3 units in a turn means that he's going to have a tough time chewing through your army if the rest of their team has to be focused on scoring those points.
Before I sign off here, I actually also think it's important to note that engaging Magnus is actually kind of terrible for him. He has a really tough time fighting his way out of melee, and while he will probably kill most units in the game with his melee attack, if you can survive the hit, he has no way to fall back and operate. He can only potentially use Kabbalistic Rituals to try to extricate himself with Doom Bolts or Temporal Searches, but that means that that's a lot of ritual points going into getting Magnus to move around the table, and if you are high enough wound count to not get Doom Bolted away, Magnus is just out of luck. The times this works most often is when you have something that's exceptionally high wound count, or you're able to pile in and engage Magnus after he's already attacked, so he then doesn't get his normal melee attacks against you. If you can set up that sort of situation, or maybe just engage him with a bunch of different units, then he does get locked down and he's not able to get lines of sight around the table or apply that strong OC6 to objectives that you want to maintain. He also can't fire his Firestorm into his own melee. He can only use his Gaze of Fate, so you're mitigating his damage output in that respect as well.
But if you have any special technology to use against Magnus the Red, let me know down in the comments section down below. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise or in the YouTube channel membership. You can join in the link down below the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.